Well, this is quite a text, isn't it? And it has all kinds of questions. I'm putting it up on the screen. It's probably too small to read, but those of you that can, I'm putting it there. Even this Shabbat, which is Shabbat Zachor, which is a participle, right? Which means a Shabbat that is related to remembering, keeping on remembering. Does this fit with our faith? It's tough. Didn't Yeshua say to forgive your enemies? In fact, some German scholars in the turn of the century, 1900s and so forth, came to the conclusion, one specifically wrote quite a significant book on this, that the God, so-called, of the Old Testament is an angry God, a bloodthirsty God, and the God of the New Testament is a loving God and a forgiving God. So which is it? The one thing that comes up over and over again when we read the history that is in the Tanakh, some would call it the Old Testament, is the unflinching, eternal, and infinite holiness of God. Is God the God of life? Yes. Then why would He sanction death? Well, we know that from the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 6, it says that the one who takes an innocent life, his life shall be taken, right? Is there a way to reconcile what Yeshua says about vows? Is there a way to reconcile what the apostles teach us about forgiving? One of the things that we tend to entirely forget is that when Yeshua talks about forgive those who have sinned against you, forgive those the way that you have been forgiven, He's not talking about the world at large in terms of disregarding the evil deeds of others. He's not saying, let evil deeds go, it doesn't matter, just forgive them. No, that's not what He's saying. What He's saying is, we have this in Matthew, when you're on your way to the temple to give a gift and you realize that your brother has something against you, what do? Leave your gift, go get it settled with your brother, and then go back. In other words, God is not acceptable if our hearts are harboring sin. That's the point, right? When He says, love your enemies, do good to those who are against you or who misuse you, pray for those who despitefully use you, what is He saying? Is He talking about Caesar? No. He's talking about those within the community, those that you have life relationship with. Now, does it mean we should harbor hatred against other people? No. But does it mean that the holiness of God should be enacted within a society in order for a society to remain? Yes. Every society in the history of the world that has gone into the area of saying, whatever you do doesn't matter, do whatever you want to do, there's no laws, just be yourself, do whatever you want to do, has failed. That society cannot maintain. And we're on the way. The thing that happens in our postmodern world is that the society is teaching us how not to think, how not to put things together and come to a conclusion. I see this quite often in our city, but I was behind somebody that had the coexist sticker. I actually have some that someone made for me, and it's the same symbols, but it says repent. I haven't put that on any of my cars at this point. Are we so naive in this society to think that we could have those whose religion says anyone who is not part of our religion should be put to death? That's part of their religious fervor. How do we coexist with that? When someone is in your backyard, has picked the lock on your garage, and is taking your tools, what are you supposed to do? Say, okay, well, let's just coexist. And give him your coat too? You see, this is not what the Bible's teaching. The Bible has, on the one hand, the revelation of God, who has clear and distinct standards of righteousness, and punishment for those who don't live in accordance with that righteousness. Now, I know there's a lot of theological tangles here, and any of you that have taken a course in ethics know. I know in my seminary days when we studied this passage and those like it in ethics, there were all kinds of questions. Let's remember that Israel, as we're reading in our Torah portion today, is a theocracy. God is in touch with the leaders of that nation and giving them direct revelation on what they should do and what they should not do. And if they don't carry out what he says, they are liable, right? It comes down to a very simplistic question. Do we serve a God who is good or a God who is evil? If we start with the premise that we serve a God who is good, then we can't say anything that he does is evil. Does that make sense? It's all or nothing. Do the Scriptures state that God is good? All the time? Yes. That there is no darkness that resides with him, which is a good Semitic way of saying nothing that's evil. So what happens when we take a vow? I don't know if you can read this or not, but I'll read parts of it. Our text today deals with what appears to be two distinct issues, the matter of vows, oaths, or obligations, and the war Israel waged against Midian. The placing of the laws about vows and oaths and obligations at this place is probably due to the manner in which this section or this pericope of chapters 28 and 29 ends. After listing all of the sacrifices for the festivals, the conclusion reads, "You shall present these to the Lord at your appointed times, beside your votive offerings and your freewill offerings, for your burnt offerings and for your grain offerings and for your drink offerings and for your peace offerings." Now, what is a votive offering? These were the sacrifices given in connection with making a vow. Naturally leads to the laws regulating vows. So, when you took a vow in ancient Israel, you were supposed to go to the priest. This isn't just a vow between you and your neighbor, necessarily. It's a vow maybe that is giving of land. It's a vow that's giving of yourself to work, and so forth and so on. So it's a vow that has ramifications within the community as a whole. So, furthermore, in the giving of the laws regarding vows, oaths, and obligations, it is clear that the women come under the protection of father and husband, for in the event that a misguided vow is made by a woman, her father or husband could annul the vow forthwith and spare the woman from having to fulfill a vow which would bring her needless harm or trouble. Does this mean women are less than men? No. Does it mean they're less intelligent? No. Does it mean that they could easily be taken advantage of more than men? Yes. We see it in our own society. So God put into place a protection for women as long as the men were acting faithfully. And of course, I know we have very mixed company with little children, but women have been the target of sexual destruction from time immemorial. And yes, I mean, they have been looked at as objects for the fulfillment of men's lust. And in the worst case scenario, we have the same thing happening of men to men in Sodom and Gomorrah. But generally speaking, in human society, women are, not because of anything they have done, but simply because of the fallenness of mankind, women have been objects of crime. So God puts forth a way for a protection. A father or husband can annul the vow and spare the woman from having to fulfill a vow which would bring her needless harm or trouble. This theme of protection for Israelite women naturally connects to the war against Midian, because it was the Midianite women who, through Balaam's counsel, caused Israel to fall into idolatry and brought upon them God's wrath. Instead of protecting their women, the Midianites misused them as objects of cultic fornication. Pardon me? Did I hear? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought somebody said something. The primary lesson we learn in chapter 30 with regard to vows is that God considers vows to be binding, and He expects that those who take vows to do so with a sincere intention to fulfill them. Vows are not something one can simply ignore or disregard when completing the vow requires more than one had initially considered. When we take a vow and you say, well, I took the vow thinking it was going to cost me $30 and now it's costing me $300. Forget it. No, you can't do that. You'd better start, before you take a vow, you'd better figure out what you're going to have to do as best as you can. Now, obviously, in a court of law, there may be some things that would disavow the vow or the contract because it was not properly made or something to that effect. We understand those legal things. This perspective of vows is given initially in chapter 30, which we read. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. The first question that confronts us is that of definitions. Is a vow different than an oath, and is that different than an obligation? Because it uses all of these terms. You may know that the rabbis make a big distinction between those. And in some ways it appears as though they had some knowledge in this. Now, I want to say I'm not in any way indicating that what we read in the rabbinic literature gives us historical understanding of the first century. I am more and more convinced that we have less historical realities in the rabbinic literature than what most people think. I don't think we have a lot of history there. I think what we have is a description of what the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries believed. You say, wait a minute, I've always heard that the Mishnah was put into writing in the end of the 2nd century, beginning of 3rd century. Not one scrap of evidence for that. None. Zero. Nada. Everybody says, well, it says that Yehuda HaNasi, who lived at that time, was the one who compiled the Mishnah. It says compiled, but it never says written. In fact, the later letters by the rabbis in the 8th and 9th century say, no, he didn't write it down. He simply arranged it for memory so others could memorize it. Now, I'm not saying that there are some societies that could pass on something over generations simply by oral memorization and it be pretty accurate from one to the other, but I can guarantee you this: things that are passed on orally have a much easier opportunity to change than things that are passed on in writing. And we have very early attestation of the written Scriptures, right? We have Qumran that's 300 years before the time of Yeshua that has the majority of the Tanakh. We have writings from at least parts of the books from the 1st century and 2nd and 3rd centuries, and quite a few actually as we get into the later centuries. So I'm not trying to say that what we read in the rabbinic literature helps us understand what's going on in our text or the way that they understood it. But what I am saying is this: we don't have a lot of early history except for the Bible itself. Is it possible that there are some historical notes or something that at least talks about what the early leaders of the Judaisms that Yeshua dealt with, what they were teaching at the time? It's possible. So basically they make a vow. The rabbis make a vow, generally understood as a dedication of something or someone to the sanctuary. And there's plenty of evidence for that. Jacob who promises to make a sanctuary for God. Israel, Numbers 21:2, where victory over the Canaanites would require dedicating the spoils of war as cherem, that is, something that is dedicated to Adonai. We know about the vow of Jephthah. Hannah vowed to what? Give the boy to the service of the tabernacle. In these examples, the vow has conditionality attached to it. Something like, if you, O Lord, will grant X, then I will dedicate Y to the sanctuary. Thus, as in our text, the vow is specifically made to the Lord, to Adonai, meaning that the vow involves giving something to Adonai. What about the Nazirite? It's likewise a vow because it is a consecration to Adonai that forms the primary aspect of the Nazirite vow. An oath also evokes, either specifically or in essence, the name of Adonai, and is generally of two sorts: that which relates to a saying land, or that which is promissory in terms of other issues. A surrogatory oath is taken to clear oneself of a charge, for example, of having misappropriated property. In other words, if you say, I'm trying to be very practical here. Let's say, for instance, you're going to sell your house. And obviously you're selling the land with it, right? So you do a survey of the land, and you say the land is this many feet by this many feet or whatever. And then you take an oath. Say, yes, this is true. You sign it on the bottom line. It's everything above is true. And then when the new owner comes and has another surveying company, they say, wait a minute, you were off by feet. What's the consequence? You're supposed to say, okay, I made a mistake. Therefore, I have to do something with this vow. I have to make it right. So there could be that kind of a thing. A promissory oath, which is more common of the two, imposes an obligation upon the oath taker, as in David's oath that Solomon would reign after him, right? A promissory oath differs from a vow in that there is no hint of conditionality. As noted above, vows and oaths may overlap in their application, as in the case of David, how he swore to Adonai and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, surely I will not enter my house, nor lie on my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes, nor slumber to my eyelids, until I find a place for Adonai, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob. Here David denies himself rest as an oath until such time as he would provide a resting place for the ark, which is a vow. So you can see there's, and I'll bring this next week. You can have it. I'll print it off so you can have a copy if you'd like it. You can see that there are a lot of different ways of understanding this. But what's the bottom line? We need to be careful when we make a promise. You know, how many times have I said, okay, yeah, I'll give you a call this week. Boy, if I don't write it down, I'm in trouble, right? I'll be sitting at my desk and say, who was that I said I was going to call? Oh, was that this person, that person? Oh, boy, now I'm in trouble. So we learn our weaknesses, and we do our best to... Now, I'm not saying that's a vow when you tell somebody you're going to call them. But if you make a promise to someone, if we're walking in the ways of the Lord, shouldn't we fulfill that promise as best we can? And if we're unable, if something happens so we're unable to fulfill the promise, then we should do the best we can to explain that to the person or to make amends or whatever, right? Okay, question or comment?
Oh, can you just, what was the passage? You're going really fast, and you're reading the top of the text, and it's actually not, if you look behind you, the top of the text
What,
is
you're talking about Psalm 132:2 and
Oh,
following?
okay.
Yeah, Psalm 132.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Top two lines are...
Okay, I gotcha. All right. Our Shabbat text makes it clear that what one speaks in terms of a vow, oath, or obligation, he is required to fulfill. He shall not profane his word. According to all that has come forth from his mouth, he shall do. This means, brothers and sisters, what the Torah is teaching us. We need to be people that keep our word. Yeah, just exactly as we're going to get to this. So, would it be better not to ever make a promise? There are some people who take these texts that way. Some of you who are younger adults, could I give you a piece of advice? Don't ever marry somebody who says, I can't make a promise. Promises are the very substance of proper relationships. The use of the verb halal, it's not found in the call actually. It's not found in the normal. This is PL, I believe. Suggests that the breaking one's word is a type of profanation, since in these cases the vow, oath, or obligation has specifically been taken with reference to God as witness. Is God a witness of our promises? Is God a witness of our vow? Yes. Of course, as our Master teaches us in Matthew 5:33, which we read, all of our words are to be considered as having been made in the presence of the Almighty, and so we must carefully do what we have said we would do. But the specific emphasis of our current text is that of a legal obligation before a panel of judges. A vow, oath, or obligation is a binding contract and carries clear legal ramifications. And that's why we have to have some people who study the law to know what is going to be our obligation. Just touch the bottom of the thing, yeah.
Is this the passage that Catholics and maybe other religions get the annulment of a marriage?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And people like the Jehovah's Witnesses and so forth take these texts to say, I can't take a vow, which is why you won't ever, those who are staunchly attached to these particular religions won't pledge allegiance. They will not take a pledge of allegiance to the flag because they say it's an oath. This is not saying don't take an oath. In fact, Yeshua says, let your yes be yes and your no, no. And by the way, if you read in the rabbinic literature, you'll discover that there were rabbis who said the same thing. For instance, be ye guilty or innocent, do not swear. Be careful with vows, not hasty with them. Rabbi Elazar says, no is an oath and yes is an oath. Granted, no is an oath as it is written, and the water, so forth and so on. Yes is an oath. How do you know? So what were they saying? These later rabbis were saying, when you take an oath, let it be yes or let it be no. Who does that sound like? You think Yeshua got it from the rabbis? The rabbis got it from Yeshua. And they were written down in later literature. Thus, the words of our Master in our Apostolic section for this Shabbat, which is Matthew 5:33 and following, are in concert with at least some of the teaching of the sages, or shall we say the sages are in concert with Yeshua, who also recognize that vows and oaths could be easily misused. When he teaches us, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no, anything beyond this is of evil, the sages are agreeing with him and he with the later sages that one's vows should be made simply and with full intention to perform them. We know that there is plenty of fine print in Yeshua's day, just as there is in ours. You know what the problem is with fine print? The fine print lets somebody have you take a vow that you can't keep, or a vow that's going to be very hurtful for you because it's going to cost you a lot more than you ever thought. This is why we try to get somebody who understands the law to read the fine print, right? But why is there fine print at all? Because we live in a fallen world. Sometimes we have to make contracts with people that we don't even know. We don't know if they're honest. We don't know if they'll keep their word or anything. But in order to buy a house, you make a contract with a bank, right? You got to hope that there's laws that will confine the bank to a legality. And fortunately, in our land, there are such laws. Not so in every land. When I remember teaching something on vows when I was over in the Philippines, and they all looked at me and said, no, you don't make a vow with anybody around here unless you know them. Because if you do, you're in trouble. It'll all be twisted. For instance, we read in the Mishnah, in Nedarim, which means vows, the discussion of specific language that rendered a vow valid or invalid. If he said, may it be to me like the lamb of the daily offering, like the temple sheds, like the wood, like the fire, like the altar, like the sanctuary, like Jerusalem, if he vowed by the name of one of any of the utensils used for the altar, even though he has not used the word korban, lo, this one has vowed in a binding way as if he had vowed by korban. Rabbi Judah says, he who says Jerusalem has said nothing. He who says an offering, a whole offering, a meal offering, a sin offering, a thank offering, peace offering, be what I eat with you, he is bound, prohibited from eating with any other party. But Rabbi Judah permits it. What did Yeshua say about this? Do you think they're trying to dissect his words? I think so. He says in Matthew 23:16 through 17, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold of the temple or the temple that sanctified the gold? So they were nitpicking on exactly how you said your vow. If you said it just right, it was binding. If you didn't say it just right, it wasn't binding. Do you suppose somebody might say it not just right so that the other person thinks it's binding and it really isn't? Thus, in this example, the temple is too nondescript while the goal of the temple is specific enough for a vow. Yeshua's point is that this is nitpicky. If one intends to make a vow, one should intend to keep it regardless of the fine print and the language that is used. Thus, Yeshua does not negate the use of vows, but only vows made on the basis of legalese that could be broken without consequence. What he requires of us, and this is the bottom line, is that we be forthright in our dealings, and that when we place ourselves under obligation to something or someone, we commit ourselves to fulfill that obligation, even if the cost is higher than we had originally considered. In Psalm 15, the righteous person who is allowed to dwell in the tent of Adonai is described as someone who, quote, swears to his own hurt and does not change. It is this kind of commitment to our vows, our oaths, and our obligations that our Lord requires. Comment, question? Or we got right up here? Have we got a microphone?
Just one thought.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
The fine print can be your detriment, but can also protect you.
Absolutely. It depends on the integrity of the person who made the fine print. Okay, and we've got another hand right up here, Josh.
It seems like Yeshua is giving us a way to, I guess, not get so entangled with the fine print, for good or for bad. And he
Right.
simply says, look, this is very straightforward. Yes means yes.
Yes, and
no
no
means
means
no.
no.
So if somebody says yes, that's it. If somebody
Right.
says no,
Right.
that's it. So Baruch Hashem.
Now, we all recognize that there are contingencies in this world and contingencies in our lives, okay? We're not judging anyone who has made a mistake or made a bad choice or something. We're just saying that our perspective ought to be what the Bible says, and that is being careful that our words are according to what God wants, and that we therefore are set to fulfill them. So the righteous person swears to his own hurt and does not change. It's this kind of commitment to our oaths, our vows, and our obligations that our Master requires. There's a difference in the case of a husband or a father who annuls the vow of a wife or daughter and the annulment of vows as instituted by the sages. In the case of a father or a husband, the vow is retroactively uprooted, so much so that one can act as though the vow had never occurred. In the case of a rabbinically annulled vow, the vow remained in force until it was annulled and the person was obligated to it until such time. So they kind of changed that later on in their religion. The ability for a husband or a father to annul a vow taken by a wife or daughter may indicate a number of things. What it does not indicate, however, is a general inferiority of women. Men are able to make equally bad or foolish vows as are women. However, the focus of our current text in this regard is not that women regularly make foolish vows and therefore they must be constantly under supervision in regard to vows, but that women must be protected from the legal ramifications of a wrongful vow. This perspective is based upon the general domestic role given to women in the Torah. In a general sense, wives and mothers have as their first God-given obligation to attend to the needs of their husband and children. The making of a home is their highest purpose. Where wrongful vows would, for example, require that they pay monetary compensation beyond their means in order to fulfill such a vow, this might jeopardize the home. The priority for wives and mothers is to be workers at home, Titus 2:5, is therefore of primary concern, and the right of a husband to annul such vows has as its focus the maintenance of the home and ultimately of the society. Let's be honest with ourselves. I mean, I know our society is topsy-turvy on this question, and I'm not in any way saying that there's something wrong with a woman who works outside of the home. I'm not saying that. But let's be honest with ourselves. In any society, is it the mother or the father who has the most time with the children? It's the mother from the very earliest days, right? I well remember with our first child, middle of the night. I know what he wants. I can't help him. I can get up and, pick him up from wherever he is and hand him off to my wife, but I go back to sleep. And I see you ladies chuckling, but I don't know that you're really chuckling. and there is, in God's creation, in the way that He made us, there is a connection of a mother to a child that is so very deeply important. We see this quite often. We've seen it close to where we live. That a family has a new baby, and by the time the baby's 6 months, 8 months old, they're already putting the baby into somebody else's care because mom has to go back to work. And we just think, what that woman is missing and what that child is missing in terms of a connection of life. So, could there be times when it would be necessary? I suppose. I'm not trying to lay down some kind of a never bending kind of an issue, but the norm ought to be that mothers care for their children in a way that molds their lives in a very proper and good way. So, the same may be said of daughters who, though they do not have the immediate familial responsibilities of a wife and mother, are nonetheless in training for such a role and are therefore to be equally guarded. Thus, the annulment of vows by a father or husband in regard to a wife or daughter reinforces the Torah perspective that the highest and greatest role of women in a society is the raising of children and ordering of the home. It doesn't mean that of that. It also highlights the fact that men are to bear the responsibility of those things that, especially in the ancient society, could result in servitude or slavery, such as indebtedness and vows that would require payment. You realize that in the ancient world, if a family fell into utter debt, the children could be sold, and the father, the man, the husband, and the wife could both be enslaved, and not necessarily in the same place. So you could understand why, if there was a way to guard against such things, that it would be wise, and God puts that into the Torah. Can you see the love of God in this for His people, for those who bear His image? But even in our own times, debt brings a kind of slavery and can have very negative effects upon marriages and families. According to statistics, and I don't know how often we should trust statistics, but according to statistics, one of the most regular causes of early divorce in marriages is finances. So in the presence of the Lord. Abandoning our pledged responsibilities is an affront to our King, and we cannot do so and think. On the other hand, when we face what appear to be insurmountable difficulties in fulfilling our obligations, we can trust Him to supply us with strength and wisdom to honor what we have said we would do. Sometimes you become a very good negotiator. Sometimes you can negotiate with those that you've taken a vow with and find a way to remain in integrity and to keep what you can possibly keep. Maybe there's some give and take on both sides. Now, this second chapter that we read in Numbers 31 describes the war which God demanded Israel to make against Midian. As always, the issue of divinely sanctioned war raises many conflicts in our minds because it seems to soil the hands of God, who is the source of life and not death. Even more difficult for us to accept is the manner in which whole societies are slated for destruction, including women and children. Remember at Jericho? How can a loving God allow such cruelty, and how is it fair that women and children, who generally had little participation in governmental aspects of the ancient Near Eastern society, should become military targets in national warfare? I mean, this is a huge ethical question, isn't it? First, we should remember that Israel's God, who commanded the war against Midian in our Parashah, is the same God who brought the flood upon mankind in the time of Noah. If we balk at his directing Israel to destroy whole cities and nations in their conquest of the land, then we must equally wonder at a God who would destroy all but 8 persons in the deluge. So the difficulty is with our limited understanding of God's holiness and justice. That's the key. We don't begin to fathom his holiness. Is God under obligation to save anybody? He would be fully just if after Adam and Chava sinned to just let the whole thing go into oblivion. Right? He could have wadded it all up and started over. You say, but then how could he have been shown to be the God of love? Well, I've watched someone who throws pots, clay, ceramics, start on a nice big pot. I remember watching him very close, and it began to wobble a little bit, and he said, okay, and he adjusted it, and he kept the wheel going, and he said, nope, this was not going to work. Put it all back together, kneaded it all up, put the lump on, and started over. If you're the creator, you can do with your creation what you desire. You own it.
He did that with the Israelites during the time of Moses.
Yeah, he did that with the Israelites at the time of Moses, right. We fail to appreciate the holy wrath of God against sin and sinners, and in so doing we diminish what is meant in the biblical record by the phrase to fear God. The fear of God is based upon a recognition that he acts in accordance with his holiness, a holiness that is a consuming fire. Now you say, wait a minute, that doesn't bring me close to God. That makes me want to get just a little bit away from him. Doesn't the fear of God also mean recognizing his love? You can fear someone for their greatness, not only because they could destroy you, but because they have given you life. Yes.
Fear of God also means, according to Proverbs, that we are to hate evil the same way as he does.
Okay, good point. I'll repeat that. The fear of God, according to Proverbs, means that we're to hate evil the same way he does. If we cannot reconcile in our own minds the reasons why he would have instructed Israel's armies to destroy an entire city with all of its people, we must fall back upon the truth that God is holy, and thus his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. In fact, his thoughts are higher above us than the heavens are above the earth, right? How high is that? Yet whatever he does, it is always in perfect harmony with his divine and eternal attributes. All that he does is holy. The Midianite women had snared Israel and enticed her into idolatry through the counsel of Balaam. In so doing, she had brought a curse upon Israel, and the Abrahamic promise was thus invoked, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. When Israel makes war against Midian, then, it is God's vengeance that she exacts. We should most likely understand that the designation Midian stands for a federation of nations that had band together for protection and were under the general rule of the Midianite kings. And ancient Near Eastern history would bear this out. The Midianites in our text are one segment of the nation and most likely should not be equated with the Midianites associated with Ishmael, the Amalekites, and Ephah. We can discuss that more in depth later. 1,000 men, this could denote a division and not necessarily a numerical value, sum, right? They had units of 1,000, which was a generally, I don't know enough military. How do they divide troops in the military today? So, well, what I'm saying is, you would say, in Air Force, a squadron, so forth and so on, a group of, a size of military strength. Pardon me? No, it's not the same. 1,000 men, this could denote a division and not necessarily a numerical sum, from each tribe were mustered for war. Phineas, functioned as the chaplain who was in charge of the trumpets for sounding the blasts in the battlefield. They didn't have walkie-talkies. They didn't have cell phones, right? How do you know whether you're supposed to go forward, whether you're supposed to retreat, whether you're supposed to hold the ground, whatever? It was all done by sounding a blast. And, by the way, could the enemy use that as a way of throwing you off? So you had to be very in tune with the order of the sounding of the trumpets that were for your particular army. The victory was complete. Midian was completely defeated, her king slain along with all of the adult men, including Bilaam, who had spearheaded the curse against Israel via the Midianite women. The troops then returned to Moses and Phinehas with the women, children, and booty of war. But Moses was angry that they had spared the women and the children. After all, it was through the women of Midian that Israel had been cursed. Moses thus declares the verdict that all the married women should be executed, along with all of their male children. Only virgin females were spared, but there is no indication how each woman's status was known. Some have suggested that it was done by supernatural selection, that God made it known who was and who wasn't. The conclusion was, however, that the ability of this group of Midianites to ever muster a standing army was rendered impossible. That other Midianites show up later in Israel's history would indicate that they came from other segments of the federation known by that name. Some have suggested that the quantity of booty listed in our chapter, is this too much? 675,000 sheep is far too large. And some of the liberals would say it's been exaggerated. But if 32,000 maidens were taken, this would represent a total population of approximately 135,000. And for nomads, as the Midianites were, the large number of livestock is not out of the scope of possibility. You can read other apologists who give you far more mathematical and scientific kind of corroboration of this. Moreover, that not one Israelite soldier was lost should be understood as a divine miracle rather than a too incredible war story. We also see the laws of corpse impurity and the ceremony of cleansing being demonstrated in our text. In chapter 31, 19 through 24, those who had killed anyone in battle or who had touched a corpse were given instructions to lodge outside of the camp and to take the required days for their purification. Likewise, metal objects taken as booty were to be passed through the fire and then washed with water for purification. Objects that would not withstand the fire were only to be washed in water, and then they were considered ceremonially clean. Such purification from corpse defilement reminds us that Israel was to be a nation characterized by life, not death. Even though war was sometimes necessary, it was not to be a way of life. The Akkadians, what were they known for? War. They were known as being the most gruesome warring nation around. In fact, according to some of the annals, when Akkadian troops would start coming toward a village, everybody would run. They didn't have to fight at all. They would just take it over because their terrible reputation had gone before them. And other ancient Near Eastern societies were also known primarily for their utter annihilation of peoples. Okay?